Police officers arrive at a quiet suburban street in Dover, New York, on an ordinary April morning. The neighborhood is still, the air crisp. A black pickup truck is parked in the driveway, its engine cold. What they find inside the vehicle will haunt even the most seasoned officers. 2 lifeless bodies slumped in the seats. How did it come to this? How did a father, a daughter, and an infant, 3 lives irrevocably entwined, end up in such a horrific and twisted tale of betrayal, obsession, and death? This is not just another crime story. This is a case that will leave you speechless. A story where a simple family reunion spiraled into a forbidden relationship, a brutal murder spree, and a shocking revelation that still chills to the bone. Today, we are diving into the harrowing story of Stephen Pladl and Katie Fusco, a case so unsettling it raises questions about love, control, and the unimaginable darkness that can lie within a family. What happens when an innocent reunion between a father and a long-lost daughter turns into an illicit relationship that defies nature, ends in murder, and leaves an entire community struggling to understand? Before we dive in, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This story is more than just a case. It's a cautionary tale of how unchecked obsession can lead to devastation. If you care about understanding the depths of human psychology and the warning signs of dangerous relationships, join us on this journey. Let us know in the comments. Could this tragedy have been prevented? What warning signs did everyone miss? To understand the horrors of what unfolded, we must first go back to a time before the headlines, the police reports, and the broken lives. The story begins in the late 1990s, when a young baby girl named Katie Rose Fusco was born and placed for adoption. Her biological parents, Stephen and Alyssa Pladl, were young, struggling, and unable to raise her. Katie was adopted by a loving family in Dutchess County, New York, who gave her a stable home, a new last name, Fusco, and the promise of a bright future. She grew up in a quiet suburban environment surrounded by family and friends who adored her. To Katie, her life felt normal, even happy. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Stephen Pladl's life was on a different path. After giving Katie up for adoption, Stephen and Alyssa moved forward, marrying and building a family of their own. They eventually had 2 daughters together and settled into what seemed like an average family life. But under the surface, Stephen Pladl was far from an ordinary man. Friends and family would later describe him as controlling, obsessive, and prone to explosive anger. Alyssa, his wife, would later recount years of emotional abuse and manipulation, a pattern that foreshadowed the horrors yet to come. Fast forward to 2016. Katie, now 18, had recently graduated high school and began searching for her biological parents. Like many adopted children, she yearned to understand where she came from. Her search led her to Stephen and Alyssa Pladl. At first, it seemed like a heartwarming reunion. Katie moved in with her biological parents in their home in Henrico County, Virginia. For a time, it appeared as though Katie was bonding with her family, getting to know her half-siblings, and reconnecting with the life she had never known. But what no one realized was that Stephen Pladl's unhealthy tendencies were already taking root. He quickly became fixated on Katie, showering her with attention and isolating her from others. Alyssa, sensing that something was deeply wrong, eventually left the home in 2017, filing for divorce soon after. What happened next would shatter every boundary of human decency. In the absence of Alyssa, Stephen and Katie's relationship took a dark and forbidden turn. They began a romantic relationship, one that would later be revealed to the world in the most horrific way possible. What makes this case so shocking is not just the nature of the relationship, but the devastating consequences that followed. The case of Stephen Pladl and Katie Fusco is a chilling reminder of how unchecked obsession, manipulation, and control can destroy lives. It is a case that challenges our understanding of family, love, and morality, and one that raises disturbing questions. Could anyone have intervened before it was too late? And how does a man cross every imaginable boundary to commit such unspeakable acts? It began with a phone call, one that shattered the morning calm and set in motion a devastating discovery across 3 states. The voice on the line was soft but strained with panic. It was Stephen Pladl's mother. Her words, halting and trembling, would haunt the 911 dispatchers who heard them. "He told me he killed the baby. I think he said he killed Katie too. She was gasping for breath as she explained that her son, Stephen, had called her just moments before. He was calm, eerily calm, as he confessed to killing 3 people: his infant son, his daughter-turned-lover Katie Fusco, and Katie's adoptive father, Anthony Fusco. The quiet resignation in his voice unsettled her. He was no longer a man pleading for understanding. He was simply reporting what he had done, and his final words to his mother had been chillingly direct. "It's over now." The dispatcher's calm response belied the horror unfolding on the other end. Law enforcement across North Carolina, Connecticut, and New York sprang into action, piecing together what they feared would be a trail of unimaginable destruction. Officers were dispatched to Stephen's home in Knightdale, North Carolina, first, where they would uncover the first of 3 horrific scenes. The house sat quiet and still as officers approached the property, the morning sunlight casting long shadows across its exterior. It was an ordinary suburban home in appearance, but something about the silence felt wrong. Inside, there were no signs of movement, no voices calling out, no cries of a baby. The officers moved cautiously through the rooms, their footsteps echoing against the floors, until they reached a small upstairs bedroom. There, in a crib that should have held a sleeping infant, they found 7-month-old Bennett Pladl, lifeless and cold. The room itself told no story. There were no signs of a struggle, no chaos, just the still, suffocating air of a house where the unthinkable had occurred. Bennett's tiny form, untouched by any kind of external violence, revealed the chilling premeditation of the act. Later evidence would confirm that Stephen had suffocated his own child in the quiet of that room. Notes left behind would reveal that this was not a moment of rage. It was calculated. For Stephen, Bennett was a symbol of a life that had fallen apart, a reminder of a relationship with Katie that was crumbling. By killing his son, he severed the last link to a future he could no longer control. The officers stood in grim silence as they processed the scene. Even for seasoned law enforcement, the death of a child, particularly under such circumstances, was almost too much to bear. As the scene in Knightdale was secured, the call went out to Connecticut. Another report was coming in, and it was clear that this nightmare was far from over. Nearly 600 miles away, in New Milford, Connecticut, the morning quiet was shattered by the sharp, unmistakable sound of gunfire. It was just after 8:40 a.m., and commuters near Route 7 and Route 55 paused in confusion and fear. Some thought it might have been construction equipment or a car backfiring, but those closer to the scene knew better. When officers arrived, they found a black pickup truck pulled off to the side of the road. The engine was off, the driver's window shattered. Inside, the carnage was undeniable. In the driver's seat sat Anthony Fusco, 56, Katie's adoptive father. His body was slumped over the steering wheel, blood pooling across his shirt. Beside him, in the passenger seat, was Katie Fusco, just 20 years old. She sat lifeless, her face pale, her body motionless as if frozen in time. Both had been shot multiple times, execution style, at close range. Investigators would later piece together that Stephen had stalked and followed them in the hours leading up to the attack. Witnesses reported seeing a light-colored vehicle tailing the truck for miles, its driver barely visible but clearly waiting for the right moment. Stephen had used the element of surprise to his advantage. When Anthony pulled the truck over, unaware of the danger behind them, Stephen approached and opened fire. The ambush had been swift and merciless. There was no time to react, no time to escape. As officers worked to secure the scene, they heard from eyewitnesses who reported seeing a man matching Stephen's description fleeing the area, speeding away toward New York. It was clear now that this was more than a series of unrelated incidents. This was a carefully orchestrated path of destruction, and Stephen Pladl was still on the move. Hours later, in the quiet countryside of Dover, New York, a single car sat parked along the side of a desolate road. The sky had turned gray and the landscape seemed frozen in a muted stillness. Officers, following reports of the vehicle, approached cautiously. Inside the car, slumped in the driver's seat, was Stephen Pladl, lifeless, a rifle still resting beside him. The same rifle used in the Connecticut shootings, the same weapon that had brought death across 2 states. Stephen had ended his own life with a single shot. His face, eerily calm in death, betrayed nothing of the horrors he had unleashed. In taking his own life, Stephen had made one final defiant choice. He would face no courtroom, no judge, no jury. Justice would never come for him. For the officers who discovered him, there was no satisfaction in the conclusion. There was only silence, interrupted by the occasional crackle of a radio or the soft murmur of disbelief. Word of the tragedies spread quickly, leaving communities in North Carolina, Connecticut, and New York stunned. Media outlets began piecing together the story, but the facts were almost too incomprehensible to process. How could one man's obsession spiral so far out of control? How could a father kill his infant son, his daughter, and her adoptive father in such a methodical, calculated manner? For law enforcement officers, hardened by years of service, this case would remain etched in their memories forever. Many described it as one of the most chilling and disturbing events they had ever investigated. As the details of the case unfolded in the days that followed, the public began to learn the truth about Stephen Pladl and Katie Fusco's relationship, a truth that made the murders all the more horrifying. The story became national news, not just for its brutality but for the deeply unsettling questions it raised about human nature, mental instability, and the devastating consequences of unchecked obsession. The investigation began with urgency, launched in the tense hours following the chilling 911 call. It was clear from the start that this would not be a straightforward case. What had begun as a frantic report from Stephen Pladl's mother was quickly unraveling into a multi-state tragedy that would demand the full coordination of law enforcement agencies across North Carolina, Connecticut, and New York. The call to action came swiftly. Police in Knightdale, North Carolina, where Stephen had lived, worked tirelessly with their counterparts in New Milford, Connecticut, where Katie Fusco and her adoptive father had been ambushed, and New York State Police, where Stephen's body would later be discovered. The crime scene stretched across hundreds of miles, and with Stephen on the run, authorities feared his trail of violence might not yet be over. Time was of the essence. The investigation was led with precision. Stephen Pladl had been meticulous in his planning, but law enforcement was equally determined to piece together his movements and motives. From the very start, the evidence began to tell a story, one of obsession, betrayal, and a chilling descent into violence. Surveillance footage would later reveal Stephen Pladl's methodical actions in the hours leading up to the murders. After suffocating his infant son Bennett in the quiet of their home in Knightdale, Stephen packed his rifle and set out on a dark and calculated mission. His car, a light-colored Honda Odyssey, rolled onto the highways under the early morning cover, carrying with it a terrifying purpose. It would take him hundreds of miles north to Connecticut, where Katie Fusco and her adoptive father Anthony Fusco were traveling together. Unbeknownst to them, Stephen had been tracking their movements. Surveillance cameras captured glimpses of his vehicle trailing them at a distance, a shadow lurking behind, its driver invisible but ever present. Witnesses who were later interviewed recalled seeing the black pickup truck parked on Route 7 in New Milford, where the ambush would take place. None of them could have imagined the carnage that was about to unfold. For Stephen, the plan was already set in motion. His destination was fixed, his actions deliberate. What investigators learned next would haunt them. As Stephen drove toward Connecticut, he made a phone call to his mother. Calm and devoid of emotion, Stephen told her of his intentions, sharing his final confession before carrying out the rest of his plan. His mother's voice, trembling during the later 911 call, painted the stark contrast, a son so cold in his words, and a mother so shattered by what she was hearing. As investigators retraced Stephen's steps, they found chilling evidence of a mind consumed by rage and control. His actions were not impulsive. This was the work of a man who had planned every step, every mile, and every shot. Inside Stephen's home in Knightdale, officers discovered several handwritten notes, letters steeped in anger and blame. The words were obsessive, fixated on Katie, whom he accused of betrayal. Stephen's writings revealed his growing instability, his spiraling loss of control, and his refusal to accept that Katie had distanced herself from him. To him, she was his soulmate, a sick and delusional justification for his actions. The surveillance footage told an equally disturbing story. Cameras positioned along key routes captured Stephen stalking Katie and Anthony's black pickup truck in Connecticut. He had been trailing them for hours, lingering at stops, watching their every move. It was clear he had waited for the right moment to strike, a moment where his targets would be defenseless. Investigators also recovered phone records that confirmed Stephen's contact with his mother before and after the murders. In his confession to her, Stephen's voice remained unsettlingly calm as he admitted to killing his son and announced his next move. This confession was his final act of control over his narrative, a statement of finality that left his mother helpless and terrified. As the pieces of Stephen's plan came together, law enforcement officers and analysts alike were left grappling with a series of troubling questions that would remain unanswered for years to come. How had it come to this? Could the tragedy have been prevented? Some pointed to the court's decision to release Stephen and Katie on bond, following their incest arrest just months earlier. At the time, they were given strict no-contact orders, but it was evident that Stephen had found ways to manipulate and maintain his influence over Katie. Had there been stronger enforcement of that order, would lives have been spared? Others wondered how so many warning signs had gone unheeded. Stephen Pladl had exhibited clear patterns of escalating obsession. His need for control, his abusive tendencies, and his volatile emotions had been described by his ex-wife, Alyssa Pladl, on multiple occasions. Her pleas for intervention were chilling in hindsight. Was there more that law enforcement, friends, or family could have done to stop Stephen's descent before it turned deadly? The questions haunted the detectives working the case, as well as the communities left reeling from the devastation. What investigators uncovered next, however, would offer chilling clarity into the mind of a man who had crossed every boundary and plunged into unimaginable darkness. For forensic experts and psychologists brought in to analyze the case, Stephen Pladl was a textbook example of obsessive control turned violent. His behavior, years of manipulation, emotional abuse, and stalking, reflected patterns often seen in perpetrators of domestic and familial violence. Stephen had shown an inability to cope with rejection or loss, particularly when it came to Katie. His twisted perception of their relationship as fated or destined blinded him to reality. When Katie began distancing herself, asserting her independence, Stephen's obsession escalated into unrelenting anger. To him, Katie's rejection was an act of betrayal, one that could only be answered with violence. His need to control didn't stop at Katie. Investigators concluded that the murder of his infant son, Bennett, was a final act of dominance. By ending his child's life, Stephen symbolically severed the last connection to the future he believed had been stolen from him. In the end, Stephen Pladl's crimes were not spontaneous outbursts of rage, but deliberate acts of revenge and control. His actions were methodical, premeditated, and devoid of remorse. A chilling portrait of a man consumed by his own delusions. The multi-state manhunt had ended, but the devastation Stephen left behind was only beginning to be understood. As investigators pieced together the final moments of his victims' lives and the path Stephen had taken to commit these crimes, they were left with a single inescapable truth. This was a tragedy built on unchecked obsession, and its consequences were irreversible. The news of the murders spread like wildfire across state lines, leaving devastation in its wake. Communities in Dutchess County, New York, where Katie had spent most of her childhood, and in Knightdale, North Carolina, where the Pladl family's fractured lives played out, were united in grief. Vigils were held in the days that followed, candle flames flickering in the night as friends, neighbors, and strangers alike gathered to mourn lives stolen far too soon. In Dutchess County, where Katie was once known as a bright, soft-spoken young woman full of promise, her loss hit hardest. Her friends remembered her for her kindness, her artistic spirit, and her quiet warmth. Teachers and neighbors spoke of a life full of potential cruelly cut short. The Fusco family, who had raised Katie from infancy, was left shattered. For Anthony Fusco's wife, Kelly, the grief was a weight too heavy to bear. She had lost her husband, Anthony, a man described as kind-hearted, protective, and unwavering in his love for his family, and her daughter, Katie, in a single morning. Anthony had been a rock in their lives, a man who gave everything for those he loved. For Kelly, the reality of what happened was too unfathomable to process. Friends described her as a woman carrying a grief so deep that words failed to capture its magnitude. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles south, in Knightdale, North Carolina, the Pladl family's home had become a symbol of something dark and irredeemable. The small community was gripped by shock at the news that Stephen Pladl had not only killed his daughter and her adoptive father, but also his infant son. For the residents of Knightdale, the house where little Bennett had been found was no longer just a suburban home. It was a graveyard for innocence. Alyssa Pladl, Stephen's ex-wife and Katie's biological mother, carried a different kind of grief, one twisted with guilt and the bitter knowledge that she had tried and failed to stop what had happened. In tearful interviews, Alyssa shared her memories of a man who had slowly turned into a monster over the years. She spoke of the red flags she had seen, the possessiveness, the manipulative behavior, the emotional abuse she endured during their marriage. Alyssa had seen Stephen's fixation on Katie grow after their reunion. She had sounded the alarm more than once, warning anyone who would listen that Stephen was unstable. She pleaded with authorities when she learned of his relationship with Katie and the child they had together. But her pleas had gone unanswered, and now the nightmare she feared had unfolded. Her words echoed through every interview, raw and broken. "I tried to stop him. I warned them. I begged them to listen, but no one did. And now my baby is gone. They're all gone." Her regret was haunting, a reminder of a mother who saw the tragedy coming but found herself powerless to change its course. As the details of the case became public, the Pladl murders ignited a firestorm of debate across the nation. The shocking revelations of Stephen's relationship with his daughter Katie forced society to confront subjects rarely discussed in public. Genetic sexual attraction, GSA, familial abuse, and the failures of the legal system to protect the vulnerable. GSA, experts explained, is an unusual but documented phenomenon where biological relatives, separated at birth, may experience feelings of intense attraction when they reunite as adults. While rare, it underscores the importance of psychological support and boundaries during reunifications between family members. In this case, those boundaries had been obliterated, and the consequences were catastrophic. Legal analysts were quick to point to systemic failures in handling Stephen and Katie's arrest, just months before the murders. In January 2018, when Stephen and Katie were charged with incest and released on bond, a no-contact order was put in place. But the court order had proven toothless. Stephen's obsession had already taken hold, and no piece of paper could stop him. Analysts argued that stricter enforcement of that order, alongside greater psychological evaluation, could have disrupted Stephen's growing fixation. The case exposed gaping holes in the justice system's ability to recognize and manage sensitive, dangerous situations involving abusive relationships and mental instability. It was not enough to charge Stephen with a crime and issue orders. His behavior demanded deeper intervention that never came. The public conversation turned toward prevention. How do we identify and stop these situations before they spiral into violence? How can systems designed to protect families and individuals better recognize warning signs and act on them? For the communities forever changed by the events of April 2018, the legacy of the Pladl case is one of heartbreak, but it also carries urgent lessons. It teaches us the importance of recognizing obsessive and controlling behavior early. Stephen's actions were not sudden. His need for control, his manipulations, and his violent tendencies were visible long before that fateful morning. It begs the question, what could have been done to intervene earlier? It highlights the need for mental health support in cases involving complex family dynamics, particularly in reunions after adoption. Families need guidance, psychological evaluations, and professional oversight to ensure boundaries are respected and relationships remain healthy. And most importantly, it underscores the vital role of the legal system in protecting vulnerable individuals. A no-contact order is not enough when dealing with a dangerous, obsessive person like Stephen Pladl. The system failed Katie, Anthony Fusco, and baby Bennett by not recognizing the magnitude of the threat. Across North Carolina, Connecticut, and New York, the ripples of this tragedy still linger. The lives lost, Katie, Anthony, and Bennett, are a sobering reminder of what happens when obsession goes unchecked. They serve as a cautionary tale, a plea for vigilance, awareness, and action. The Pladl case is not just a story about one man's descent into darkness. It is a wake-up call. It forces us to look at the warning signs we so often ignore. It asks us to take action when we see toxic behavior, to advocate for mental health intervention, and to ensure that the systems in place to protect the vulnerable do not fail again. For those left behind, the grief will never fully fade. For the communities who watch the tragedy unfold, the scars remain. And for the rest of us, this case is a stark reminder that unchecked obsession and control can destroy everything in its path. The case of Stephen Pladl and Katie Fusco is more than a crime story. It is a haunting reminder of how obsession, control, and emotional manipulation can shatter lives beyond repair. The story challenges us to face the darkest corners of human nature and confront uncomfortable questions we often avoid. How do we recognize the warning signs before it's too late? How can we intervene when someone is spiraling out of control? And how can families, communities, and legal systems do better to protect the vulnerable? This tragedy lays bare the harsh realities of familial abuse, unchecked mental instability, and the societal stigma surrounding issues like genetic sexual attraction, GSA. While GSA remains rare, experts stress that it highlights the complex emotional fallout that can occur during family reunifications. This case demonstrates the need for psychological support, professional oversight, and a deeper understanding of the boundaries that must exist to protect those involved. But this isn't just a story about one family's tragedy. It's a cautionary tale for all of us, a plea to take the warning signs seriously when they appear. The seeds of obsession and control rarely sprout overnight. Stephen Pladl's violent actions were years in the making, fueled by behaviors that were ignored or minimized until it was far too late. Awareness can save lives. Recognizing toxic behaviors, whether they emerge as emotional abuse, manipulative tendencies, or dangerous obsessions, can make the difference between safety and devastating loss. This case underscores the importance of prioritizing mental health intervention, especially when troubling patterns are visible. Families and individuals navigating complicated dynamics must have access to professional support systems that can help them navigate relationships with guidance and care. The justice system also plays a critical role. Court orders, no matter how strict, are meaningless without enforcement. Stephen Pladl's descent into violence was not inevitable. It was preventable. It forces us to consider how we can strengthen our institutions to better recognize and respond to danger before lives are lost. At its heart, this case serves as a chilling warning about the consequences of silence. Staying silent when the signs of obsession or abuse are clear can cost lives. Taking action, speaking up, and fostering environments where seeking help is safe and encouraged are steps that can break cycles of control and violence before they escalate into tragedy. Behind every headline are real people, people with dreams, families, and lives that matter. Katie Fusco, Anthony Fusco, and baby Bennett were not just names in a news story. They were loved. They had futures full of promise. The case of Stephen Pladl robbed them of those futures and left scars on all who knew them. Their story forces us to reflect on the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of unchecked behavior. It is a reminder of how quickly obsession can spiral into violence when boundaries are shattered and intervention comes too late. As viewers, listeners, and members of communities, this story is a call to open our eyes to the warning signs around us. It's a reminder that speaking up can save lives, that no concern is too small to voice, and that silence in the face of danger can be deadly. If this story has moved you, let it move you to act. Let it remind you of the importance of staying aware, staying informed, and staying vigilant. Share this story with others, not as entertainment but as a lesson. The lives lost in this tragedy deserve to be remembered, and the lessons learned deserve to be heard. Subscribe to this channel to continue exploring the stories that matter, the stories that force us to ask hard questions and reflect on the ways we can create safer, healthier communities, and share this story with others. Let it serve as a beacon of awareness and understanding, a chance to spark conversations that might save someone's life. In the end, stories like this are not meant to be forgotten. They are meant to shine a light on the dark corners we often ignore and to inspire us to take action where it counts. As we close this chapter, remember this: behind every tragedy are lives that deserved more, futures that were taken too soon. The case of Stephen Pladl and Katie Fusco is one that will linger in our minds, not as a tale of horror but as a solemn reminder that unchecked obsession can lead to devastation. Thank you for being a part of this story. Stay aware, stay vigilant, and take care of the people you love. Until next time, remember, a single voice, a single action can make all the difference.